For more than 100 years, football was built on one simple idea. A club belonged to a place, a city, a neighborhood, a community. Fans didn't choose their club because it was the richest or because it had the biggest stars. They chose it because that badge represented their history, their family, and their memories. But football is entering a new era. Today, clubs are no longer competing only on the pitch. They are competing through global markets, billion-dollar investments, and millions of fans around the world. Because while supporters watch the 90 minutes, investors are watching something else. Data, brand value, growth. The game is changing, and the biggest question is no longer who will win the next match. The question is, who owns the future of football? For decades, a football club had one very simple limitation. Its audience was nearby. But the internet changed the rules. Today, a club can have millions of fans who have never even visited its city. And for owners, that means something very important. The market has no borders anymore. A club no longer sells just tickets. It sells jerseys across continents, broadcasting rights, global sponsorships, digital content, and above all, attention. But here is where things get interesting. A local fan might spend hundreds of dollars every year following their club, while a fan thousands of miles away can represent a much larger market for global brands. That is why some matches now start at times that seem strange to local supporters. It isn't an accident, it's television. A match played at 3 p.m. in England can become primetime entertainment on the other side of the world, and when millions of people are watching, every minute has a price. But this transformation went even further. In 2017, Juventus unveiled a new crest. It wasn't simply a modern version of the old one. It was a letter, a J. The idea was for the new symbol to work not only inside a stadium, but also on a jersey, an app, a store, a smartphone, or even a fashion brand. The club was thinking beyond football. And that leads to an uncomfortable question. When does a football club stop selling football and start selling a global identity? Because while fans are still thinking about badges, rivalries, and memories, modern clubs are also thinking about something much colder. How much is our attention worth? If you want to understand how football is changing, look at Red Bull, because Red Bull didn't simply buy football clubs. It created a system. In 2005, the company took control of SV Austria Salzburg. The club had existed since 1933, but after the takeover, the name changed, the colors changed, the crest changed, and the traditional identity of the club was pushed aside. For many supporters, this wasn't a rebrand. It was the destruction of their history. Some fans refused to accept it. They walked away and created a new club called Austria Salzburg to preserve the identity they believed had been taken from them. But Red Bull had a different vision, and that vision became even bigger. In 2009, the company entered German football with RB Leipzig. Instead of starting at the top, Leipzig began in the 5th tier. The goal wasn't simply to build another football club, it was to build a football system. A system based on scouting, data, athletic development, and a very specific style of play. And then something remarkable happened. The same philosophy began appearing across the Red Bull network. Young players could be identified early, developed in one environment, and eventually moved to a higher level. Names like Sadio Mane, Erling Haaland, and Dominic Szoboszlai became part of this wider football ecosystem. The strategy was simple. Find talent before everyone else, develop it, increase its value, and move it to the next level. It sounds like a business model, because it is. But there is another side to the story. Red Bull showed that a football club could be treated almost like a technology company, a global system, a recognizable identity, a shared methodology, a pipeline of talent. And that raises a question football never had to ask before. What happens when the club itself becomes the product? Because if you can reproduce the system, can you reproduce the club? And if you can reproduce the club, what happens to the soul? If Red Bull turned football into a system, City Football Group took that idea to another level. In 2008, Manchester City changed forever. The club came under the ownership of Abu Dhabi United Group and began a transformation that would turn City into one of the biggest forces in world football. But the real transformation wasn't happening only in Manchester. It was happening on the map. New York, Melbourne, Yokohama, Montevideo, Girona, Palermo, Mumbai, Bahia. Clubs in different countries, laid with different cultures, cultures, but connected by the same corporate structure. The idea was revolutionary. Why own just one club when you can own many? Each team can serve a different purpose. Develop young players, find talent, train players, expand a brand, enter new markets, and of course, win. One of the most fascinating examples was Girona. For years, Girona was nowhere near being considered one of Spain's biggest clubs, but during the 2023 to 24 season, something unexpected happened. Girona finished third in La Liga and qualified for the Champions League for the first time in its history. For its supporters, it was an extraordinary story, but it also opened a debate. Was this simply the result of great management, or was it also the result of being part of an international network with access to resources, knowledge, and talent? And this is where things become complicated. When several clubs belong to the same group, competition is no longer completely independent. Players can move within the network, knowledge can be shared, training methods can be replicated, and a decision made in one city can eventually affect a club thousands of miles away. For a businessman, that's efficiency. For a football fan, it can be something much more complicated, because football was always built around one simple idea: my club against your club. But what happens when several clubs that are supposed to compete against each other belong to the same corporate family? And that is the real revolution. We're no longer talking only about buying players. We're talking about buying geography, because whoever controls clubs in different countries doesn't just control teams, they control markets, talent, audiences, and an increasingly large part of football's future. But then comes an even more uncomfortable question. Where does a club's identity end and a company's strategy begin? The question seems simple, but in modern football, it's becoming harder to answer. Today, a club can have millions of supporters who have never even set foot in its city. Manchester, New York, Tokyo, Buenos Aires. For clubs, that represents something enormous, a global audience. And that audience can be turned into shirts, subscriptions, sponsorships, and digital content. But here's where things get interesting. The fan who inherited the club from their father, and the fan who discovered it yesterday on TikTok and can feel exactly the same passion. And now clubs have to answer a question that barely existed before. Who is the team really playing for? Because when your audience is no longer just in the stands, but on millions of screens around the world, the stadium is no longer the limit. It becomes a window into a global market, and that's where the real conflict begins. Today, he can also become an investment. Age, statistics, potential, market value, even social media followers. Everything can be measured, and that has changed the way clubs search for talent. It's no longer just about finding the best player. It's about finding him before everyone else does. A teenager who costs a few million today could be worth 10 times more a few years later. That's why scouting has become far more sophisticated. Clubs use huge amounts of data to identify players with specific physical, technical, and tactical profiles. And multi-club networks take this even further. A young player can develop in one country, gain experience in another, and eventually reach one of the biggest clubs in the network. On paper, it looks incredibly efficient, but it raises a fascinating question. Are clubs developing players or developing assets? Because when every pass, every sprint, and every statistic can affect a player's value, he is no longer judged only by what he can do on the pitch. He is also judged by what he could be worth tomorrow, and that may be one of the biggest changes in modern football. But not everyone accepts this new version of football. In Germany, the 50+1 rule still limits outside investors from taking full control of most clubs. The idea is simple. The club should still belong, at least in large part, to its members. And then there are the fans who went even further. When Wimbledon FC was moved to Milton Keynes in 2003, supporters refused to simply walk away. They created AFC Wimbledon, a new club built around the identity they believed had been taken from them. It started in the lower divisions. No billion-dollar investors, no global network, just fans, and thousands of them followed. Because that's the part of football that money still struggles to reproduce. You can buy a stadium, you can buy players, you can buy advertising, but you can't simply buy generations of memories. And perhaps that's why, despite everything changing around it, the most powerful thing in football may still be the same thing it was 100 years ago: the people in the stands. But after everything we've seen, one question remains: is football evolving or losing its identity? Money has built bigger stadiums, better academies, and taken the game to millions of people around the world. The problem isn't that football is a business. The problem is when business starts deciding what football should be. They can buy clubs, they can buy players, they can buy markets. But there is one thing they still can't buy: the reason someone loves a club. What do you think? Is football growing or losing its soul? This is goal legacy.